Our debate begins with an early doctrinal misrepresentation of me from the announcer that would be controlling the entire debate.
He believes eternal security is entirely conditional and can be lost.
The doctrine of eternal security is defined by both Charles Stanley and Charles Ryrie as, quote, that work of God in which he guarantees that the gift of salvation once received is possessed forever and cannot be lost, unquote. Hence, I certainly don't believe in eternal security at all in any form. The Bible teaches a conditional security for the believer, and this is what I believe. The eternal security radio announcer at a very early point misrepresented my beliefs and will do this at least 3 other times. Calvinism has a double message. Here Mark presents the sanitized version.
The other that I would prefer to articulate as, my Calvinist brothers articulate as perseverance of the saints, meaning once you meet Jesus, you're going to continue to walk with him. Not that you are sinless and perfect as he was, but that you're growing in your hatred of sin and your likeness of Jesus, and that's how we know who the Christians are. They love Jesus, and we see change that is ongoing throughout the course of their life.
According to this statement, a Christian is going to continue to walk with Jesus. Later you will find out that he must apparently think that this can be done even when in the most heinous sins possible, since Calvinists think King David remained saved while in adultery and murder, the prodigal remained saved while in wild living and being with prostitutes, that drunkards can be unrepentant and saved at the same time, etc. In fact, Mark himself admitted he has all kinds of sins.
I have all kinds of sin.
Since Mark admitted he has all kinds of sins, he actually disqualified himself from being a spiritual leader according to Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. It also seems apparent that he is not sorrowful for all those sins that he has. This goes with the typical false idea in eternal security circles that one has to sin all the time and all sins are of the same degree. Furthermore, how can Driscoll give the false impression that a real Christian is growing in his likeness of Jesus, and that's how we, quote-unquote, know who the Christians are, but 1 John 3:10 states something that is clearly different. Quote, this is how we know who the children of God are and who the children of the devil are. Anyone who does not do what is right is not a child of God, nor is anyone who does not love his brother. Unquote. Again, here's what Driscoll wrongly taught.
But that you're growing in your hatred of sin and your likeness of Jesus, and that's how we know who the Christians are.
There Mark said we can know who the Christians are, but later he will deny this is possible. This will be just one of his doctrinal contradictions. The truth is, a real Christian is one who is following Jesus and putting his word into practice. He is also one who is obeying God according to Hebrews 5:9. Getting back to what Mark Driscoll said earlier, he said that Christians love Jesus, and there is ongoing change in their life. This sounds great, but the problem is this is not what he always teaches as an eternal security proponent. This is evident by his unscriptural understanding of the sin that leads to death. For Mark and other eternal security proponents, if it is D. James Kennedy, Dave Hunt, or whoever, the sin unto death occurs when God in his anger and wrath strikes dead an unrepentant, habitual adulterer, drunkard, etc., then takes him to heaven. Mark specifically mentioned the alcoholic who God kills because he remains unrepentant to the end of his life and is taken to heaven.
And pick a sin, any sin, and I just decided I just did not want to repent of that and stay in it. I'm yet a believer, but that's just going to preempt my journey here on earth. I'm just going to see the Lord a little bit quicker. That's just my take on that.
And cost you rewards in heaven, is that?
Yeah, so she's talking like maybe alcoholism or gluttony or whatever it is that is going to take your life prematurely because sin leads to death.
Exactly.
Mark also didn't disagree but fully agree with the phone caller and the radio host who lethally believes a sin unto death is a believer who remains unrepentant in any sin, regardless how vile and wicked, is killed by God and taken to heaven. Only their rewards will be lost. Another glaring problem surfaced when Mark also said Christians love Jesus. This is a Bible fact, but the glaring problem is Mark doesn't really believe that at all. He is claiming something for his own theology, which is false. How can I say this? The Bible states to love Jesus means that you are going to have to obey Jesus, John 14:15, which is something he thinks even the Apostle Paul was not able to do.
At one point in writing, I'm a sinner. He says at another point, I'm the least of the apostles. And as he writes a little bit later, he says, I'm the worst sinner of all.
Since Driscoll thinks Paul was the worst of sinners and he went to heaven, he therefore must believe the worst of sinners can go to heaven if they were ever regenerated at any point. Also, eternal security teachers don't say that Paul ever repented of being the worst of sinners. How then did Paul, as the worst of all sinners, even worse than Judas, conform more and more to be like Jesus? Driscoll thinks Paul was the worst of sinners. This also brings up another glaring problem for his theology. Since he thinks all sins are the same, then how could any sinner be worse than any other? Moreover, does he really think Paul was worse than the prodigal when in wild living and with the prostitutes, or King David when he was in adultery and murder? The worst of sinners would have to be more vile than they were in those sins. Could that be the Apostle Paul of the book of Acts? Never. That would be impossible, but that is how these people distort the truth of God. Listen again to how Mark Driscoll teaches we can know who the Christians are, which excludes what he said about the Apostle Paul.
Once you meet Jesus, you're going to continue to walk with him. Not that you are sinless and perfect, as he was, but that you're growing in your hatred of sin and your likeness of Jesus, and that's how we know who the Christians are.
What a horrible and shocking, dangerous distortion of the Bible eternal security is. To slander Paul's image is to also smear the image of a real Christian. The Bible declares, quote, "The man who says, 'I know him,' but does not do what he commands is a liar, and the truth is not in him." Unquote. 1 John 2, verse 4. From how Paul is typically slandered by the eternal security proponents, if that was true, 1 John 2, 4 would have to label Paul as a liar, and the truth is not in him. How could the person God used to write half of the Bible be without truth? Driscoll also said,
1 John 2:19, they were with us, but they really weren't one of us. And there's a lot of people like that. Jesus says that in the church there'll be wheat and tares.
Mark Driscoll mentioned 1 John 2:19, but failed to cite that the context shows the ones that departed did not believe Jesus was the Christ, according to verse 22. Their doctrine was that blatantly in error. They obviously didn't appear to be Christians, for certainly all Christians believe Jesus of Nazareth is the Christ. Driscoll also tries to connect 1 John 2:19 to people in the church who go back to wickedness. But folks, think about this. How can he consistently say this when he and all other Calvinists believe that a truly elect person can't commit the sins of David, adultery and murder, the sins of Peter, disowning Jesus, the sins of Solomon, idolatry, the sins of the prodigal, wild living and being with the prostitutes, and the sins of the unnamed man in 1 Corinthians 5, which was incestuous fornication? The eternal security teachers have a double message and will teach whatever is best for them at the moment. Thirdly, Mark Driscoll mentioned the wheat and tares because he wrongly thinks they cannot be distinguished from each other. He is speaking the popular view of Calvinism. It is vital to realize that tares can be identified from the wheat in Jesus' teaching. In Matthew 13:27 and 28, we read, quote, "The owner's servants came to him and said, 'Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?' 'An enemy did this,' he replied. The servants asked him, 'Do you want us to go and pull them up?'" Unquote. It is clear the weeds or tares could be identified from the wheat, as the servants identified them as such, which led to the servants to ask if they should go and pull them up. When Judas was mentioned, part of Driscoll's rebuttal and defense of eternal security was,
You're saying that Jesus Christ's death on the cross, you want to talk blasphemy, is not enough to actually forgive sins.
Such a slanderous, ludicrous answer seems to almost be the norm with these people when discussing eternal security. That is a horrible misrepresentation of all Christians who reject the security and sin gospel of eternal security. Of course, Christians believe Jesus' death was enough to forgive sins. Many seem to think that because these teachers mention Jesus' death at Calvary, his blood, grace, and other biblical terms, they are sound when they are far from being sound. Driscoll also was abusive here.
Talk a lot. Just take your Paxil, sit down.
Jude said the people who change grace into a license for immorality are scoffers or mockers in verse 18. They also talk abusively against whatever they don't understand. Verse 10. Mark has displayed this by his name-calling.